If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who go for night walks/shifts. What freaky, scary things you've seen. I worked nights at a dog kennel. During the night we'd just walk the dogs around the parking lot so they could go to the bathroom. The parking lot was surrounded by a wooded area on most sides. There was a stray cat colony living in the woods behind the parking lot. Every time I'd walk a dog through the parking lot, the cats would sprint away and hide in the woods. They did not like the dogs at all, they were terrified of them. One night I'm walking a dog and I see the cats, but this time they're sprinting out of the woods toward me. All the cats just kind of gather in the middle of the parking lot, completely ignoring the barking dog I had. It definitely freaked me out. What was out in the woods that scared the cats out so much that they came running towards me and a dog they were usually terrified of? It was probably just a few coyotes or something, but it felt really creepy wondering what was scaring the cats so badly just out of view in the woods. I grew up on a farm. One night I was supposed to check the irrigation pumps at 2 a.m. It's a 2-mile drive and I am mostly asleep. I parked the truck with the lights aimed at the river. When I get out, the headlights are projecting my shadow on rapid layers of fog coming from the river. Above that, the fog was dissipating into the wildest northern lights display I've ever seen. It was like a sheet being violently shook from one horizon to the other. The farm has no sound or noise pollution, there was nothing else to obscure it. The northern lights have a sound, it's like sand on rough paper. So I took several moments to just take in my silhouette was joined visually to green mist across the sky that filled my vision and my ears. I was a teenager, living in a small town. I was with a friend, it was about 2 a.m. We were facing a hill up ahead. I saw something moving toward the top. It appeared to be coming toward us, on the sidewalk. As it got closer it became illuminated by a dim streetlight. From a distance, it appeared to be very tall, around 7 feet if I had to guess. I couldn't see its feet. The way it was walking was more like a gliding/swaying motion. Slow, but it felt like it was faster than was comfortable at the same time. The weird part was that I couldn't see any features. It looked though it was white, the way the street lamp hit it. But like white robes. Imagine a 7-foot tall, thin, thing, dressed in a full burqa. I don't know how else to describe it. It looked like robes, the way the fabric swayed. And I could not see a face. I couldn't even see clearly defined arms or legs. It was just swaying and gliding down the hill on the sidewalk, with no one else around. My friend and I exchanged some WTF between us and turned off the road very quickly toward my house. To this day I have no clue what it was. I'm sure the explanation is very asinine, but I'll never forget it, and the feeling of dread that washed over me seeing it. Oh God. I've got this. I'm a 21-year-old male, 6'3", 220 pounds, deep voice. Big guy. I wasn't ever worried about walking alone at night until the woman. It wasn't too late, maybe around 10 p.m. I was walking around my suburb like I usually do, and I had just hit this long stretch of sidewalk when I saw a tall, skinny woman along the path, walking her dog toward me. Now I understand I strike an imposing figure, so whenever I encounter others on my walks I do my best to be less intimidating. So as I walk nearer to this woman, I say good evening, how's it going, stuff to lighten the tension. This is where it gets weird. She says good evening, how's it going? Then she says it again, and again, 3 times in total. Each time she said it, she progressively got closer and closer to how I said it, almost like she was doing an impression of me. That already kinda got me on edge, but then her dog approaches and so she drags the dog away. Intent on my mission to lighten the mood, I say, ha ha, no worries. And then she says ha ha, no worries 3 times, once again progressively approaching my vocal pattern, except the ha ha was rather robotic. By this time, I had passed her, but I didn't even want to look behind me. I just superpower walked the hell out of there, and when I got home immediately locked the door. Didn't sleep too well that night. I don't walk around late at night too often anymore, and when I do, I usually bring someone with me and claim I want to socialize. Years ago I was a night shift CNA for an assisted living facility. I had a resident that had a wild week. She didn't have dementia/Alzheimer's either, so it added more weirdness to the situation. It was about midnight when I was doing my rounds when she bursted out of her room holding her giant cross and looked white as a ghost. I asked her, what's happening? Did you have a bad dream? She replied after she caught her breath that was someone in her room telling her to get out. Now we have wanderers in our facility, and I looked around in her room thinking one may have spooked her. I found nothing. She followed me around that night and didn't go off to bed until 4 a.m. I thought that was the last of it. I was wrong. The next night it happens again. She once again claims a man is in her room telling her to leave. Once again I check her room and find nothing. This is where things got really weird. One night when I was in the back helping a resident, my buzzer went off that the front door was opened. I quickly finished up what I was doing and bolted to the front door. Those doors are locked at night. When I found the corner to the front office, I see her standing outside with the door wide open. She was looking at the sky in awe. I asked her what she was doing as it was 2 a.m. at this point, and she looked at me, put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Death is coming for X." I had to let him in. I coaxed her in the building with a cup of decaf coffee and some biscuits. She told me about the man in her room again and how he's making it difficult for her to sleep. Curiosity got the best of me and I asked if she can tell me what he looks like. I really don't believe in the paranormal. I feel like everything can be explained, but I can't explain how she accurately described a resident who lived in her room years ago. He was an angry man who didn't want to be in the facility in the first place and passed away after refusing his medication. He didn't like anyone in his room except a few CNAs. She even got his name right. Her family started getting concerned for her well-being and asked to have her transfer rooms. After she was moved down the hall, her nightmares stopped. I asked the other PCWs and CNAs if any of them mentioned anything about the previous resident in her old room. All have stated they didn't. I used to work for a private security company about 20 years ago. Along with alarm response, we covered patrol checks, and occasionally checked in/provided backup to security guards at individual sites. One night in particular I was working overtime covering off a particular run I had never done before. I know the city well, so finding the buildings wasn't a problem. I was, however, warned about one particular building. The CEO was facing charges, and the board wanted extra overnight checks to ensure the CEO wouldn't try anything shady. No problem. "Oh, and by the way, the building is haunted." "Sure," I said. "I'll leave Casper a coffee for you." Now, the way this building is set up is 3 floors, vertically stacked, a single hallway with offices on either side, and stairwells/exits on either end. Not a big building. Including paperwork, in and out in 10 minutes, tops. The first time I was walking the top floor back towards the front stairwell, I was shining my flashlight into various offices, noticing the ornate woodwork on the exquisitely done wood paneling, and paintings of old men I didn't recognize. And about 3/4 of the way through the hallway I heard it. A chair being dragged across the carpet. I was alone in the building. I had just walked through all of it. I turned around and shone my flashlight on a chair now placed in the exact middle of the hallway, where I had walked 5 seconds prior. Had the chair been in that spot when I passed, I would have walked through it. With the hair standing up on the back of my neck, I checked the nearby offices, then put the chair back against the wall beside the end table, just outside the office door where it had previously been. I went downstairs to do the paperwork and heard the shuffling upstairs again. Went to the landing on the stairs where I could see the hallway with my eyes at floor level, and saw the chair back in the middle of the hallway. I worked as a bartender for about 5 years. I would usually get out around 3 a.m., 4 a.m. on weekends. One bar I worked at was next to a small portion of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. It was a Saturday night. Some of my friends would usually hang out with me at the bar until I got out. So we were all talking and I was moving some just clean glasses around. I randomly looked outside and saw 2 red dots in the woods about maybe 4 inches apart from each other but evenly leveled. So I'm staring at these things thinking what the heck are those, when all of a sudden the 2 dots rose up about 7 feet in the air, and I could see that the red things were probably eyes, because I saw a silhouette shape of something crouching underneath them when it suddenly stood tall. It was blacker than the darkness around it in the woods, so it was the darkest thing I've ever seen. Suddenly, it turned to its left and started walking farther into the woods. Of course none of my friends saw it. I didn't have time to point it out. So they didn't believe me. But I know what I saw. I take my pup out at night because there are less people to complain when at the park, so she can run without a leash and just have fun. She's a great girl and very smart, but you know, people and leashes. Anyhow, she was over near the woods and starts giving her play bark. Not her mad, angry, worried, or hunting bark. So I start heading over her way. Next thing I know, she is flying by me with a pair of foxes hard on her tail barking right at her. I was worried to death. My dog is gonna get eaten by foxes right in front of me. So I ran back towards where she headed when she comes tearing right past me again. With the same pair of damn foxes. Took me a bit to realize they were all playing. They caught up to her, rolled her, then split up so she could chase them back. Took me forever to rein her in. Scared the duck out of me. This really should not have surprised me, however. When she was 2, she brought a baby coon in her mouth and was mothering it. I am pretty sure she found it wandering and figured it was a puppy. Returning it to the woods was hard, cause we had to lock her up so she wouldn't go rescue her baby. A strange looking fox, its face literally looked like it had a pixelated skull superimposed over the top of it. I work in an animal shelter and was out doing the morning dump checks, checking the perimeter for any dumped pets overnight, and had one of our resident dogs with me, who was absolutely oblivious to the strange looking fox perched on the wall opposite. I watched it for a while, half expecting the skull thing to disappear in the way that exhaustion-induced hallucinations do, but it didn't. It was shimmering in the moonlight. I eventually finished my checks and continued walking up the road and could still feel this thing's eyes burning into my back. I turned round and it was still there, watching. Our dog finished its morning toilet and I turned around to head back with this thing still watching me. Usually foxes run off at the sight of humans, but this one stayed. Obviously the logical explanation is it was sick with a skin condition giving the fur around the face a skull-like appearance, and it didn't run away because it was dying or too ill to move. And I'm generally not scared of foxes, but this thing terrified me and I'm still shuddering now at the thought of it, several years later. The other explanation I have: shapeshifter. Not me, but my uncle used to operate a movie theater in the 80s. After the midnight show, he would shut off the projector, take that day's collection in a bag, lock the theater and walk home. Midnight show usually ends around 2 a.m. and the streets are completely empty during that time. The road to his house is a narrow unpaved one, barely one car can fit. As he reached that road, he saw a little girl around 12 years old standing there with an expressionless face. My uncle asked, "Why are you here, kid? Where's your home? I'll walk you home." The kid kept giving him a creepy death stare and wasn't saying a word. After a while my uncle stopped trying to get her talk and decided to walk home. He started walking and after a while he turned back and the kid was gone. Suddenly he felt a weight on his shoulder as if someone heavy was sitting on his shoulder. He fell to the ground, losing his balance cause of the weight. He managed to get up and looked around, but no one was seen. He got up and ran home. He still doesn't have an explanation to what had happened. He said the weight he felt was heavier than a 12-year-old girl. Not necessarily walk, but I enjoy just driving around late at night if I'm bored. My city isn't exactly walk-friendly, hence why I drive. Anyways, there are dirt roads and canyons that are easily accessible and can be driven through no problem. It's actually really crazy given that Los Angeles is right there. But yeah, these are all on the outskirts. I remember driving through a dirt canyon road in the middle of the night, probably like 2 a.m. It's a barren road and there's literally nothing out there. No real trees or gas stations. No houses. It's just a canyon road that you'd take if you want to avoid the highway. But as I turn a corner I see a guy. At 2 in the ducking morning. I see a dude wearing all black, holding up a sign. I can't remember what it read. I was really freaked the duck out cause literally this is not a road you want to hitchhike on, especially that late at night. How the duck did he even get there? Like literally I had no idea where he came from or how he could have gotten there. There is nothing around us for miles. That's really what scared me, that I can't tell you how he got there. I remember mimicking Lana from Archer as soon as I saw him, just straight new op. I just kept on driving, didn't look back. I worked as an attendant in a large, 3.5 level, underground parkade. It was mostly walking around doing security work with a bunch of additional janitorial stuff. On the night shift we worked in pairs. One guy would man the booth, armed with a coffee and a long paperback novel, and the other would walk laps, check the cameras, and clean the stairwells. Occasionally escorting drunks out or friendly homeless to spots we could let them sleep out of the public eye. I had read the most I had ever in my life, finishing a trilogy of books in a couple of nights, before deciding patrolling was actually the cushier gig. A few days into patrolling I decided, just to break up the monotony, I'd spin around in our golf cart to do the rounds. As usual, it was fairly uneventful. Until I turned on the second level and my headlights illuminated a jet black rectangle on a white wall. A maintenance door was wide open. Rotating shifts are really bad for your mental health. With my headlights pinning the unfathomable void to the wall, I radioed my coworker and asked if we had any scheduled maintenance tonight. Of course we didn't. And that door was closed 30 minutes ago. And no vehicles had entered the parkade in 5 or 6 hours. He suggested I close the door and carry on. It would automatically lock when closed, all the maintenance doors do. I sat in silence, observing and being observed by the inky darkness. Noting that the headlights couldn't reach into the room at all. I pulled out my patrol flashlight and switched it on, pinning the abyss more tightly to the white wall in a brighter circle of light. I still couldn't see into the room. I rose, stepping into the headlights. As I approached, my shadow stretched bravely ahead of me through the threshold. This door opened into an absolutely cavernous section of the parkade. As I scanned inside with my flashlight, it had trouble finding anything but the floor to illuminate. The only indication that the room didn't stretch out to infinity was a utility hall, faintly illuminated in red light and outlined with ductwork and conduit. It too seemed out of the reach of my flashlight. The usual din of the air system sounded like a roar in the silence of this space. I swallowed and reached inside, taking hold of the doorknob. And the moment I touched it, I was absolutely certain that something was silently rushing towards me. Maybe sleep deprivation, maybe not. I wasn't chancing it. I swung it closed and I heard the distinct sound of the heavy commercial door latch and I jumped back. Nothing. I sighed. The rest of the night I had to keep checking to make sure no one was knocking to be let out. No one did. Morning shift didn't have to let anyone out either. Man, I've been going on night walks with my cousin since I was 10 and edgy. While we have been fortunate to never have any truly dangerous events, I can say there have been some spots where we lost our marbles in favor of fear. There is one time that unsettles me to this day. We were 14 years old, very used to going on night walks and very used to the natural oddities that come about from such unscrupulous circumstances. As we sauntered along our deserted highway and into the park of our nearby elementary school, there was nothing of note except the stunningly clear night, and the absolute lack of noise. I can't describe how profoundly wrong it feels when a place you have been wandering for years goes dead quiet. It is discomforting, like waking up to all your furniture being rearranged, or noticing through the corner of your eyes two orbs peering at you through the shadows, only to have them disappear once you look directly at them. There should have been wind sounding through the school's flag nearby, there should have been cars occasionally streaming by the roads next to us. Even our footsteps felt like they couldn't speak for fear of waking up something that was all too happy to tear us apart, for even disturbing the absolute, perfect, pristine silence which entombed us. We wandered through a splintered wooden bridge with cage surrounding it to keep the tree branches from reaching in, and heard it. An elephant's trumpet. Coming through the night like a freight train comes for a car on the tracks, and getting closer with every second. We ran for our lives as it thundered closer and closer until we were sprinting at speeds to make light notice and possibly help in order for us to reach the safety of our grandma's house nearby. Yet once we reached the roads, it stopped. We didn't. As soon as we got home, we vowed to never step foot outside at night again. That didn't stop us for longer than a week, but it is no matter. When I was in college, I went for a walk at about 1 a.m. away from my dorm and across a nearby soccer field. The moon was out, so there was plenty of light to see by. At the back of the field was an entrance to a trail through a patch of woods connecting one part of campus with another. I stopped at the entrance to the trail. It was dark, only a small amount of moonlight could get through the trees. I tried for 10 minutes to convince my lizard brain to walk down the trail, but every time I took those first few steps onto the foot-worn path, a wave of concentrated nope shot down my spine and actually prevented me from taking another step. I didn't see anything, but I don't think I had ever felt a genuine adrenal flight response like that before. It was an instinct embedded in my biology to keep me alive, because my ancestors were the ones who didn't go walking away from the campfires into the darkness, never to return. That night I learned where superstitions about ghosts and forest monsters come from. It was fascinating to experience. Went walking once at night with my pup. Going along walking and felt odd. The night was dark and the only light was house lights, so I am walking along with the dog down the middle of the road when we turned a corner and a long flat street was ahead of us, and behind the road dived down into a creek valley. I felt odd, something was off, but continued walking with my dog. Down the hill behind me I heard something. It sounded like something scrabbling on the gravel. Moving fast towards me. The dog looked back, then was ready to move away from the sound. I followed the dog, then heard a meow. I felt stupid for being afraid of a cat. The dog was, however, still scared of the meow. Then it got weird. The meow started again. Then another, and another and another. Over and over, rapidly. The meows became a continuous sound that rolled over and over. Like a recording that had been looped. I looked back and shined my flashlight back to the crest of the hill and saw something lower its head below the shine of the light. Then I heard the loudest meow and nothing else. I kept walking and looking over my shoulder the entire way home. I was outside smoking late one night, and heard the oddest noise ever. It was incredibly loud and deep. Like I was hearing something massively loud from a good distance away, if that makes any sense. It was in the cadence of the Jaws music, like, da-dun. I felt like I could feel it in the ground. It was so loud and so deep, it was absolutely jarring. And then the sky turned to daylight. It wasn't an explosion of light, it was a very fluid dark to bright daylight, and then back to dark. About 10 to 15 seconds total. I sat in shock for about 30 seconds to a minute before it happened again. I'm someone that always looks for a logical explanation, and my brain landed on a blown transformer or something similar. But I've heard and seen that happen many times. It wasn't even remotely similar. I must have watched hundreds of YouTube videos of blown transformers and substations, and again, not the same, especially the light. I scoured through Twitter, Nextdoor and everything else. Not a peep about it. I know there has to be a logical explanation, and I'm never gonna know what it is. I don't believe in supernatural or religious shit. But in that moment I thought it sounded like the gates of hell opening. And when the sky lit up, I thought, oh shit, is the rapture real? Across the street from my high school there were woods that we would throw parties in. We'd have a bonfire and there would be anywhere from 5 to 100 plus people in the woods having a good time. We had a few scares when people would approach with flashlights because the cops had raided these gatherings before. One particular night we saw a single flashlight coming down a hill towards where we were hanging out. We got quiet trying to figure out if it's someone we know, cops, or possibly someone coming to kill us. The flashlight went out and I could make out that it was not just one person carrying a flashlight but at least 10 people coming towards us. The people were coming over a hill and they just kept coming. There must have been 200 people wearing all black walking silently through our little party area. None of them said a word, they just walked through where we were and disappeared over a hill. This one weird kid followed them and disappeared for 2 days. He came back to school and wouldn't tell anyone what happened to him. I live in a suburban area, with a small village about a mile away on one side, and mod land and woodland on the other. One night, I was riding my motorcycle home from a little reunion I had with some friends. I hadn't been drinking, I'd only had water, and had stayed out particularly late this evening as I hadn't seen these friends in some time. It was late January, when the skies are super dark in the early morning still, and as I rounded a bend near my house I caught a glimpse of a weird shadow in the forest by the side of the road. I wanted to make sure it wasn't a homeless person trying anything untoward, so I pulled up on a nearby pavement and turned my bike off, walking back to where I'd seen it, about 25, maybe 30 meters. When I got to the corner, I looked at the spot the shadow had been. It was still there, although this time, while I was still, I could see 2 yellow orbs at about waist height, just catching the light of a street lamp, with the rest of its body hidden. I laughed at my own paranoia, realizing it was only a fox. This is the creepy bit. The orbs moved upwards. As they became closer to the light, I could actually see the pupils from where I was standing, as well as a brown patch of what I could only assume is fur on its face. The orbs moved slowly, carefully, and all the while trained on me, and stopped at least a head above me, putting it at a minimum of 7.5 feet tall. After that, I heard rustling, and it turned away from me, and it was gone. I don't think I've ever performed corners tighter or quicker than I did that night, and the second I got in my house I triple-checked every lock on every door. I seriously kind of need night walks, it's like I'll just kind of die without them. So I'm not really afraid of night things or woods things even though people think differently just by taking a look at me. One time though in our memorial park that I often walk through, even now, I saw a nun in full habit and robes, just walking out from the trees on one side to the trees on the other side ahead of me on the trail ahead of me, and there was no mistaking it because there are plenty of lamps all along the way. She didn't notice me and it was well past sundown, and there is absolutely no reason I can think of why she would be crossing the woods like that. I had that chill that people talk about when they talk about ghosts and I noped on out of the park and back home real quick. And I didn't feel comfortable until I locked the door behind me. There is a convent in town but it's like 3 miles away from the park and a nun at night in black robes sneaking through the woods is too creepy even for me. My family doesn't like to make the dogs hold it more than 8 or 9 hours overnight. So we usually walk them around midnight. Where we live, that's reasonably safe. We're in a small town, everybody knows everybody else and their grandmother. The only person nobody knew was this kind of awkward middle-aged guy who'd randomly jog through town sometimes. But there's a bike trail by the school. Lots of people from neighboring towns go there. That's normal. Sometimes, when I was walking my dog, I'd see that jogger. Only he'd donned a wig and put on women's clothing. Not normal women's clothing, though. This was old lady clothing. Specifically, an old lady dress that looked frighteningly similar to what Norma Bates wears in Psycho. It got creepier as time went on, because he always wore the same Norma Bates dress on his midnight jogs. So it started to seem like the midnight runs were less about gender expression or experimenting with feminine clothing, and more about waiting until midnight to run through town in a creepy old lady dress. He'd heavily mouth breath on the midnight jogs and do this awkward shuffle run. He didn't do that during the day. And he wouldn't acknowledge anybody during his jogs. Except my mother, who he would greet unprompted with a gruff hello during the day. I haven't seen the guy in a while. Can't say I miss being startled on walks by him suddenly coming around a corner. I used to be one of the nighttime duty managers at a hotel. The hotel consists of the main house, which was built in the late 90s/early 2000s, and the old house, which was built in the 14th century. There are a few spooky stories about the old house and the grounds, which all come from actual events. At one point it was listed as the third most haunted building in Britain. I wouldn't say that I was a believer or a denier of ghost stories. I thought some events can be explained and some can't. Being a local, I was familiar with all the stories, and my dad had worked there for years when I started. Like I say, wasn't a believer and wasn't a denier. That was until I became a duty manager. Being a duty manager is a simple enough role, dealing with complaints from hotel guests, handing over to the next duty manager, etc. One of my duties as a nighttime duty manager was to lock up areas of both parts of the hotel, places like the bar, restaurant and gift shop. Other things such as making sure fire doors are closed, that emergency lighting is working, and closing and locking windows for security. This part of the job was extensive: every window, fire door and emergency lighting. I had to check this every single night. Now, the old house is where all the spooky stuff happens. In the old house is a chapel, pretty standard for a house of that size and age in Britain. This is where I experienced the first spooky thing. There is one window in the chapel, that no matter how many times you close and lock that window, the next time you walk past, it'll be open again. This was experienced by myself, the other duty managers and even the security guards. Nothing horrifying, but it gets worse. The next spot is a set of stairs called the Jerusalem staircase, named so as the wood for the stairs comes from Jerusalem. Some stories about a ghost dog on these stairs that trip people up. I don't think anything of this. It's stairs, people trip on stairs all the time. However, they lead to a room called the Long Gallery. Now this is a very long room, close to 100 meters. Other than the length, there is nothing else to the room. I was doing my rounds one night, had come in to do my checks as normal, when suddenly I can hear heavy footsteps coming from the other side of the room, which is possible. There are guest rooms at the other end. I shine my torch down the room and can see nothing. Then it gets scary. The footsteps slowly become harder and faster until they sound like someone sprinting towards me. I am frozen. Next thing I know, whack, I've been shoved against the wall with pain in my back, stomach and chest like I've been tackled. There is a similar room directly above, but that is only accessible to duty managers and security. Again, not the only person to experience this. Back at the end of my college days, I had a full-time job at a highway rest stop, evening shift. For clarification, a scheduling misshape meant I had only one class to take to graduate, and it was only offered in the second semester, so I ended up getting the job to pay rent. Basically, I cleaned the place. Since it was the evening shift, and I worked 10-hour shifts, I was there until midnight. Semis had parking in the back of the building for drivers to spend the night. One night in particular, there were only 2 trucks. Not the most unusual thing, but definitely fewer than what was usually there. Because this was in the Midwest, the land surrounding the rest stop was, you guessed it, just unending corn. That night I was outside changing bags in the outdoor trash barrels when I noticed a guy at the back of the lot, right at the edge of the asphalt, staring out into the cornfield. I thought maybe he was one of the 2 truck drivers, and that he'd just chosen to piss in the field instead of going all the way to the building. I went back to trash duty and forgot about it. 10 minutes later, all 8 trash cans are emptied, 4 in front, 4 in back, plus bonus sweeping and cleaning of the outdoor vending machine areas. There's not much work to do by this point, and this was before the explosion of smartphones, aka when I didn't have one, so I went outside to make sure there wasn't any trash on the ground that needed picked up. Something to do. Guy was still out there, same spot, facing the cornfield, in what looked like the exact same position he'd been in before. He had to have finished peeing, so I watched him to see what he was doing. At one point he looked like he was turning his torso around, like he was about to turn, but then he quickly snapped back to face the field, like he'd been caught staring at something he shouldn't have. I had an overactive imagination, and this rest stop was virtually in the middle of nowhere with poor cell service and no internet, so this by itself freaked me out. I went inside and hid in the locked employee office basically the rest of my shift. He wasn't out there when I left to go home, at least from what I could see looking out from the lobby, but I was jumpy going to my car regardless. IDK what he was doing. Looking at the sky and thinking about stuff? Sleepwalking? On something? Dunno. Probably would have been less scary if there'd been more people about. Never saw anything that weird at that job again. As a teen I worked at a fast food burger shack. My boss was a greedy, stingy asshole who totally disregarded worker safety laws and insisted we work 24-hour shifts to accommodate as many customers as humanly possible. Now, it was just me and the fry cook. Really naive kid, bit of a square. I told him a story about the hash-slinging slasher, an undead figure with a spatula for a hand. The story I told him was that he was a fry cook who died after being run over by a bus and was fired at his funeral, and that his presence was indicated by the flickering of lights, the ringing of a phone with no answer from whoever called, and the bus pulling up in front of the restaurant and dropping his ghostly figure off. Suffice it to say that I had scared my poor coworker shitless. I, on the other hand, was proud of the little tale I had spun, that is until the lights flickered and the phone rang, followed by a bus pulling up in front of the store. Now, I was scared. A silhouette emerged from the fog and began approaching us. He appeared to have a spatula for a hand. Me and my coworker held each other as the figure approached, ready for certain death. Then the man stepped into the light and introduced himself as someone who was simply there to apply for a job as a fry cook. He said he had called earlier to apply for a job but got nervous and hung up. The flickering lights were just counter lock from the 1922 silent horror film Nosferatu. Strangest night of my life. True story. Many years ago I suffered from pretty severe insomnia. I had just gotten laid off from my dream job, which forced me to move back in with my parents. We lived in a small Rust Belt town with a ton of old and rotting buildings from the defunct steel industry. Most of these buildings were along the river and had their own roads, which were great for nighttime wanderings. I walked around a lot when I couldn't sleep. On this particular night I was walking along a road that I had been down a few times. The river was on my right, just beyond a thin line of trees, and on my left was a pretty densely wooded hillside. I knew there was an old steel mill on the other side of the hill, but the turnoff for it was quite a ways down the road. I remember that it was a breezy night and that the moon wasn't quite full, but it was bright enough that I wasn't using a flashlight to see my way. I was about halfway down the road, lost in my own thoughts, when I realized that I could hear the unmistakable noise of an engine coming from somewhere behind me. My first thought was that it was a barge on the river, but I couldn't see any lights on the water. I started to panic and thought maybe it was a cop or a watchman who was going to bust me for trespassing. I was pretty sure this was a public road. It connected a state road with a local road, but maybe it was private. For whatever reason I decided my best course of action was to get off of the road. I scrambled up the hill to my left and hid behind a fallen tree like I was Frodo hiding from a ring wraith. After a minute or so a beat-up old pickup truck came into view. It was moving at a snail's pace, didn't have any lights on, and there were two men inside. It stopped right around where I had left the road, which really freaked me out. It was like they were looking for me. 1,000 thoughts started racing through my head, mostly inspired by horror movies, but I guess I wasn't what they were looking for because the driver put the truck back into gear and started crawling down the road again. Then I heard the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. I can only describe it as the creaky voice of a witch yelling out, "He's here." The truck stopped, the passenger snapped on a spotlight and started scanning the hillside. I hunkered down behind my tree hoping that I wasn't too exposed when we heard the scream again. I grew up in this area and knew that this wasn't the sound of any local animals. I could hear the guys in the truck talking, but I was too far away to make out exactly what was being said. I convinced myself that this was some kind of kidnapping ambush. The guys in the truck had followed me and they had a lookout hidden in the trees to keep tabs on me if they lost sight of me. In hindsight this was an insane thing to believe, but I was barely sleeping and sleep deprivation does some crazy things to your brain. I decided to try to make a break for the steel mill on the other side of the hill. The lookout had been quiet, so I took that as a sign that she had lost sight of me as well. I moved from tree to tree, avoiding the spotlight like I was in a stealth level of a video game, and just as I made it to the top of the hill the lookout started screaming, "He's here! He's here! He's here!" I slid down the crumbling shale on the other side of the hill and found a place to hide inside of the nearest building. As I took some time to catch my breath, the wind outside picked up and I heard the lookout yell again. Only this time it was much closer to me and it didn't sound so much like words anymore. Curiosity overcame my fear and I left my hiding place to find the source of the sound. It didn't take long. Another strong gust of wind was followed by the inhuman scream that no longer sounded like "He's here," and I saw the source, a rusted old sign on an equally rusty pole that was blowing in the wind. I was so relieved that I started laughing hysterically, only to snap out of my elation at the sound of a truck coming up the drive to the mill. I was caught square in the spotlight and for whatever reason I put my hands behind my head like I was about to be arrested. The driver yelled out to me, "Joseph Gordon Lightfoot, is that you, man?" The men in the truck were my brother's friends. They were out spotting for deer. They saw me on the road and then run off into the woods, but from as far away as they were they thought I might be a deer. They were just as freaked out by the voice until I walked over to the sign and sent it swinging. We all had a good laugh about it and they ended up driving me home. The three of us went back a few days later and experimented with the sign. Our best guess is that we were in the right location of the valley for the metal-on-metal noise to sound like words. We had some fun convincing our younger siblings that there was a witch that lived in those woods that you could hear yelling out on windy nights. This must have been when I was about 16. I was walking with a friend in a woodsy mountain area. It's a small mountain, in my hometown because it's effectively a shortcut from one end of town to another if you're on foot. Even so, it was rare for people to go up there as it's not really good for camping or anything due to being so rocky. It was slightly illegal a bit to be on and there were better places to hide from the cops to smoke weed and drink. We were, in fact, a little bit high ourselves, but just trying to get to my friend's house to crash. We're walking and we have this shitty keychain flashlight that is sort of lighting up whatever we directly point it at, but it's mostly just darkness, not really an issue because there's a path and we're well accustomed to it. Off the path we hear like a soft almost twinkling, something very low and musical, so soft that we couldn't quite be sure that we heard anything at all. After a little back and forth debate we decide to check it out of curiosity. That probably sounds pretty dumb, but again, this is an area we know well, a small town we know well, there's a certain sense of security to what we're doing. But it is pitch black and as we're coming off the path the flashlight is seeming dimmer and more inadequate and the music is faint. Faint. And then suddenly ramps up to a very high volume and my friend drops the flashlight. It's a song called Black is the Color of My True Love's Hair by Nina Simone. It's a pretty song. But in complete darkness at high volume, in the middle of the woods, it is ball-retractingly terrifying. Then a much brighter light shines in our face, piercing the darkness, but blinding us. It's low on the ground, like someone is laying, crouching, looking at us. The music stops, it's dead silent and at this point I'm experiencing a sensation I've only experienced once since years later where I had to hold in a huge piss for like 6 hours. I can only describe it as urethra spasms. From beyond the light, a voice speaks, and it proclaims, sorry. 2 older than us, college kids had snuck up to visit Bone City and drink, passed out and rolled over onto their iPod Shuffle as we were walking up. Romantic, retro music had become nightmare fuel, chaos ensued. I was 18 to 19, in kind of a shitty spot in life, living in these ghetto apartments with a filthy roommate 20 plus years older than me. I took his chihuahua, Rosie, for a walk down a normally busy street in my hometown, but there were basically no cars on the road at 3 a.m. For whatever reason, there was a sizable field in the middle of this suburban area with an abandoned house and a giant, looming tree that looked a bit dead. Not at all a believer in superstitious stuff, especially since this was my militant atheist phase, but I still can't quite figure out what happened. On the way back to the apartment, Rosie started to act weird. Had her tail between her legs, reluctant to walk forward. Normally you couldn't get her to slow down. We begin to pass the field on the sidewalk, and I'm basically having to drag her at this point. I'm looking down at her, trying to get her to calm down as I walk forward. As we reach a cinderblock fence bordering the field, I look up and something in my field of vision seemed off. I look back up again, and it appeared as though the shadows on the fence were moving. I was probably about 15 to 20 feet away, so I'm trying to look around to see what could be casting the shadow while still dragging Rosie along. Before I could get much closer to the fence, Rosie absolutely booked it in the other direction. She was so fast that she broke her collar chain. I immediately chased after her and had to carry her in my arms as we start to pass the field again. I was kind of freaked out, but mostly scared I was about to get mugged or something. I got almost halfway and then I heard it. The most inhuman, unnatural, terrifying scream I've ever heard in my life. Impossibly loud and close. Dead stop. I was frozen in here. My rational brain thought someone was getting murdered in the dark field or maybe the abandoned house. Rosie was trembling. I didn't know what to do and I didn't want to get murdered, so I started to briskly walk away and eventually ended up walking alongside this really normal neighborhood. Then I heard it again. Just as intense, and loud, maybe even closer than the last time. Didn't hesitate this time. I sprinted home faster than I've ever run in my life. I had to hold Rosie's fat ass the whole time, and didn't think to wait for the crosswalk. Lucky I didn't get hit by a late night driver. Slept with a big ass screwdriver in my hands, only weapon-like thing I could find, and was unnerved for a couple days. The more I thought about those shadows, the more I remembered them moving in such a strange way. And the scream. I can still hear it in my head. The way the noise had such despair and intensity. It didn't seem to travel like most sounds, Seemed loud enough that people would have woken up to see WTF was. I've looked up different animal calls and sounds wild cats make when they're mating or fighting. Still haven't found anything like it. I'm sure there is an explanation, but it's still the second most scary supernatural thing I've ever experienced.